Well, yesterday was one hell of a night. I'm actually kind of happy that I didn't do a Super Tuesday pregame show yesterday, because I probably would have been incredibly wrong in my analysis. Because looking at the polls yesterday, I would have not come to the conclusion that old Joe Biden was going to have such an upset victory. Frankly, I have been rather bearish on him from the beginning. He, to me, looked very much like the next Jeb Bush. I thought that, after his terrible showings in Iowa and New Hampshire, which again were reminiscent of Jeb Bush, that he didn't have much of a future. But of course, that was, only taking momentum into account. I have repeatedly in the past pointed out that, hey, I do see why, Joe versus Jeb, has more of an incentive to stay in the race for longer, because he knows that the black folks in the South are not going to go for Bernie, and that will be, his saving grace if he can make it there. And so I never thought that, necessarily Bernie would have some blowout win last night. That never occurred to me. However, I thought that, if Bernie could build up enough momentum in those early lily white states, meaning Iowa and New Hampshire, and then, you saw in a place like Nevada, which is not the Democratic electorate there. It's not like it's overwhelmingly white. You have a lot of Hispanics, but because it's such a union-dominated state, you have, I guess you could say, socialist leanings, because that's historically, unions and socialism go hand in hand. So they're more of a demographic that would be, and I don't mean demographic racially. I mean demographic as far as, the unions, the union demographic is going to be more open to Bernie's message. So it makes sense why he did well in Nevada. And he did so overwhelmingly well in Nevada that I thought maybe he'd have enough momentum to carry him through South Carolina and through Super Tuesday, even though that those are states where he would not be doing necessarily well. But if he had that aura of inevitability that we've talked about so much, well, then he could weaken Biden enough in these states where Biden is naturally strong to where he might be able to hang on through all of this. And that didn't happen last night. And I think there were some very good reasons, not only in hindsight, but even in foresight, that you could have seen as to why Biden overperformed last night and why Bernie so terribly underperformed. And it all starts, of course, with the South Carolina primary this past Saturday. In order for Bernie to have maintained his front-runner status and his very good momentum that he had coming out of Nevada, I did not think, nor did I ever expect, that Bernie was going to win South Carolina. However, what I thought that he needed to do in South Carolina, and I don't think I've done a video at all on the South where I've mentioned the South Carolina primary, so forgive me if I'm restating things from a couple days ago. But what he needed to do in South Carolina was not defeat Biden necessarily, but he needed to erode away Biden's support enough to where Biden, in a state where he should be very strong, okay, South Carolina, that's what we've been hearing about for the whole time that Biden's been in the campaign. Oh, wait for South Carolina, wait for South Carolina. Biden needed to underperform there, even if he still won. If it was a weak performance, if Bernie was in, say 5 points of Biden, I would consider that to have been, looking very good for Bernie and definitely a loss for Biden. However, Biden didn't underperform in South Carolina. In fact, he well overperformed, and he got about 49% of the vote, I think. So far and away, the winner there. He won, just as strongly as Bernie won in Nevada. And so once this happened, you saw something very interesting in the media, and I think that the media played a very big role in what happened here this past night. Because after the South Carolina primary, the narrative shifted, especially in the Sunday shows, of, Biden as the comeback kid. This was, his moment like Bill Clinton had in 1992 in New Hampshire, his famous line that, "New Hampshire made Bill Clinton the comeback kid." They recycled this narrative for Biden in South Carolina, and essentially said that, hey, now that he's done so well in South Carolina, well, it looks like he's got momentum, and he's the front runner going into Tuesday, even though that was the first state that Biden had won, and Bernie had already won too. And it's not like Bernie came in last place in South Carolina. So I on Sunday wasn't necessarily thinking that Biden is all of a sudden the front runner, but that was the story that the media ran with, and you have to remember that the folks who are voting in a lot of these Super Tuesday states, just like voters in general, tend to be a little older. They're a little more influenced by the news, and they're Democrats, so they're not inclined to distrust the mainstream media in the same way that Republicans are. As far as Democrat voters are concerned, only really a subset of the younger demographic is at all skeptical of the mainstream media. And so while media narratives, like let's say about Trump, for example, weren't that effective in crushing his campaign in 2016, I think that Bernie has a lot more to contend with when it comes to the media, because the people he's trying to court, Democrat primary voters, are so much more disproportionately influenced by media narratives. And so that to me is an important factor that played into his loss last night. It was, the media shifted very quickly to say that Sanders does not have momentum and that, he is not the inevitable nominee. He did not have the aura of inevitability, which is something that is bestowed upon you largely by the media in this sort of a context. Now, the last major factor that I think contributed to Biden's, crushing victory last night, to where he won 8 or 9 states. I think that Maine is still too close to call. Oh, never mind. So Maine is, 98% in. I don't know if it's officially called, but, I'm going to call it. Biden's 2 points ahead. So looks like Joe Biden beat Bernie in Maine even, which, that really is a big story tonight. If you look at the, now that we have enough states to compare really from 2016 to today, obviously there's more people in the race now than there were in 2016 because it was Bernie one-on-one. But in states where Bernie did overwhelmingly, was overwhelmingly strong, places like Minnesota or in Maine, he lost last night, which shows that Bernie today is weaker than he was in 2016, which is really remarkable considering that his ideas are so much more mainstream now than they were then. Bernie seemed much more radical to the Democratic electorate in 2016, and yet he did better. And while a lot of that is his own fault and can come down to his campaigning, without kidding, I'm not a big time Bernie guy, and so I'm not necessarily in a position to judge what he did that is that sounds the best or was the most appealing to Democratic voters. So I'm not going to try and analyze his particular strategy. I don't think that I'm necessarily the most qualified person for that. But something to me that stood out that I think people understand now was certainly a detriment to Bernie was the way after South Carolina, who dropped out and who didn't. The 2 folks that dropped out after the South Carolina primary, well, 3 actually. 1 was Tom Steyer, 2 was Amy Klobuchar, and 3 was Pete Buttigieg. And Steyer always was a non-entity, so that wasn't a big announcement. But Klobuchar and Buttigieg were running in the same lane as Joe Biden. The slick establishmentarian, say whatever's on the cue card kind of Democrat. Folks who have been called, I didn't coin this term, but I've been using it. I can't remember who I heard it from, but default Democrats. Folks who are just, hey, I vote Democrat because my parents voted Democrat kind of people. Those were the folks who Klobuchar and Buttigieg and Biden were trying to appeal to. With those 2 getting out of the race and endorsing Biden, there wasn't really much else place for those folks as voters to go other than to Biden. I'm sure some because of the woman thing. Some maybe Klobuchar's folks might have gone to Warren just because she's the other woman. There are people who vote based on stuff like that. There are some women who would, I had family members who, even though they were lifelong Republicans in 2008, wanted to vote for Hillary Clinton in the primary and then found out they couldn't because of closed primaries in Florida and stuff like that. But, these things do happen. And the same thing goes the other way. There are folks who wouldn't vote for a woman for president, both men and women who feel that way. I think that's dumb, but it's a reality. So some of Klobuchar's folks would have gone to Warren. But either way, there weren't very many people who, after Pete Buttigieg and Klobuchar dropped out, who would have gone to Bernie. So Bernie really had nothing to gain by those 2 getting out. He had everything to lose because that just bolstered the support of Biden. And, what else really hurt Bernie after South Carolina is who didn't drop out. And that, of course, is Liz Warren. Warren, as, President Trump proclaimed today on Twitter, will not be remembered as a winner in 2020, far from it. But she may be remembered as a great spoiler. A spoiler for Bernie because, she's running essentially as Bernie in a dress when in reality she is, I think Tim Pool came up with this line, she's Hillary Clinton in a Bernie mask, which is pretty great. I don't necessarily know that I agree that she's entirely as bland and as establishmentarian as Hillary Clinton. I think that she tries to have some of that left wingness about her, but she certainly is not a principled person. She's certainly a grifter. She's certainly someone who cares much more about power than she does about ideology. And so I think it may be a fair prediction or assessment even to say that the only reason why Warren would still be in the race when she clearly has no chance and hasn't had a chance in a while is to play spoiler for Bernie and to try and sap off some of his votes by playing the hard left winger on TV and pulling away his support, cutting into the far left lane. So as to benefit who else but the establishment, but Joe Biden. And of course, perhaps there might be some deal that it was worked out, in a smoke-filled room, as to what she has to gain from doing this. Whether that's a cabinet position or the VP slot or whatever. Now, a lot of people are declaring that Bernie is finished after last night. I don't necessarily think that's the case. An even greater number of people are saying that there's going to be a brokered convention, which I just don't see that as something extremely unlikely. A brokered convention is something that is often talked about and often suggested. And in 2016, there were people saying the whole time, "Oh my gosh, there's going to be a brokered convention," when there really wasn't. That's what people say when there's a lot of high energy on both sides and when there's a lot of polarization within the party. But the delegate count doesn't necessarily reflect all those feelings accurately. The delegate count tends to be much more heavily weighted in one way or in the other. Although, if you look at the delegate count right now, Bernie, while slightly behind Biden because of last night, he is still not quite neck and neck, but he's up there with Biden. He's close. He is not, a dead man yet. But considering how he performed in states that he did very well in 2016 last night, that doesn't give me a lot of confidence in him moving forward. I think that he has a lot of ground to make up as far as the perceptions go, because people, even if he does still have a chance mathematically, people don't see him as a winner right now. And so if he's to compete with Biden moving forward, he's going to have to recapture that momentum. And now that, because Super Tuesday, there were a lot of states that tend to be not very far left, to where the Democratic Party within them tend to be much more moderate. And that benefited Biden a lot. You had a lot of southern states last night, and all of those were going to go to Biden regardless. And so now that those are out of the way, and that future primaries are going to be in somewhat more progressive states, well then, does that give Bernie the opportunity to try and claw his way back? Some would say yes, but I mean, considering how he did last night in Minnesota's not a southern state. Minnesota is a fairly left-wing state. It's a state that I believe he won like 62% of the vote of in 2016, and he did not win last night. I originally only planned to do a brief recap of the Super Tuesday events and then talk about the stock market and how that relates to last night, because there are people drawing comparisons. But I guess I'll have to leave that for tomorrow. I don't want to give away too much of the content as far as that's concerned. But, I almost totally forgot to mention, old Mike Bloomberg fell flat on his face last night. Of course, Bloomberg only got in because it looked like Biden was doing so poorly. Not too long ago, and until very recently, until Saturday, really, everyone assumed Biden would fail because, I mean, just look at the guy, look at the tapes. He can barely string together two sentences. And so Bloomberg was sort of waiting in the wings to come in and pick up where Biden left off after he collapsed. And of course, Biden didn't do well in any of these states. So it looked like it was perfect timing for Bloomberg to come in on Super Tuesday. He dumped $500 million into ads leading up to last night. In fact, the ads are still playing today because, he's done lots of ad buys. They're already baked into the cake, so the Bloomberg ads will keep running for a little while. But they seem to have no effect because Biden, for whatever reason, turned out he was much stronger than any of us had anticipated, or at least than most of us. I'm sure there were some people who anticipated this. But with Biden now on the up and up and looking strong, Bloomberg's campaign loses its raison d'etre. And so it's not surprising that Bloomberg dropped out. Frankly, he's wasted enough money, and he may not even look at it as a waste, because really, what that was, that $500 million ad buy, which by the way, I guess he's worth like $60 billion. That is 1/120th of his net worth. That's a decent chunk of change for Bloomberg. That really was an insurance policy against Biden's loss and Biden's floundering and his failure that Bloomberg didn't end up needing to file a claim on. And most of us buy insurance, with the understanding that hopefully and probably we will never need it. But when you do end up needing it, you're glad you have it. And so Bloomberg, I think, can get out feeling all right now. Because it looks, at least, like Bernie's going to have a very tough time, and to the extent that that Biden does have a chance, that anyone has a chance of beating Bernie, Bloomberg, by staying in the race, is only going to make it tougher to do that because Biden is doing so strong. Bloomberg's not going to outperform Biden, and so the only thing he can do is play spoiler and throw the nomination to Bernie. So he knows that, and he got out. Warren clearly is not getting out, even though she knows that she's playing spoiler and throwing the nomination to Biden. That just shows where her loyalties lie, that she, is not putting ideology first in this case. And so now I think that's probably where we stand as far as the Democratic race is concerned. I think I summed that up properly. My thoughts have condensed over the course of the day. So if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.